Welcome to the Low Countries Radio, a collaboration between Republic of Amsterdam Radio and the Low Countries website, celebrating Flemish and Dutch history and culture and its impact on the world today.
Welcome to the Low Countries Radio. My name is Joe Wegasani. In recent times, societies around the world have been facing conflicts and issues to do with their histories, often centered on the lack of perspective included within those histories or within wider social narratives. The second half of the 20th century saw major global shifts in the form of civil rights movements and the proclaimed independence of many former European colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, as well as the decline of the powers that had formerly held them in administrative and military subjugation. These shifts have led to a general widening of the historical lens to incorporate experiences and points of view which had previously been forgotten or even deliberately ignored. As a result, in both former colonies and former colonial ruling states, people and institutions are currently seeking ways to update and upgrade the information being presented to the wider public. The aim is to, quote-unquote, decolonize the past and give voice to those participants in it whose voices were so often muted. One of the people seeking to do this is Bart Ouvry, who is 1.5 years into a 6-year term as the director of the Royal Museum for Central Africa, otherwise known as AfricaMuseum in Tervuren, Belgium, just outside of Brussels. And he was kind enough to take time out of his busy schedule to be the guest on this episode. Julian Smith, our photographer for the day, Katie Kent, and I all drove to Brussels from Amsterdam to meet with Bart on a gloomy mid-December day. Along the way, we saw a lot of fields of damp cows, reams of traffic, and the endless suburbia of Flanders, until suddenly the view dramatically changed at Tervuren. Parking the car and stepping out into the cold, misty air, we looked up and were greeted by a giant, tree-laden park, replete with a great big pond and heavily manicured hedgerows, but over all of which stood, dominantly, a grand 125-metre-long building in the neoclassical style, making it look much more like a palace than a museum. The origin story of this museum is rather dark and cruel, but we will leave it to Bart to explain that in the interview. Suffice it to say, however, that by the late 20th century, the nature of such a museum was being widely and critically called into question. This led to a 5-year renovation plan that started in 2013, intended to revamp the museum, both physically and philosophically. Indeed, the goal was, and still is, to decolonize the museum itself. In the physical sense, this was done in many ways, but primarily through the construction of a new glass building that serves as the museum entrance, inviting the visitor to view the older palatial building as a museum piece in and of itself. To explore the philosophical changes, however, we headed to the Director's Pavilion, a smaller building off to the side. Decolonising a colonial museum is nothing if not a hugely difficult task. Since it reopened in 2018, this endeavour has continued to receive mixed opinions from many different perspectives. This testifies to the complexities and controversies that remain inherent within any discussion about historical narratives and what different and divisive consequences they can bear for people today. To hear more about the museum team's journey in forging a path through this mire, we were lucky enough to sit down with Bart in his office at the newly branded AfricaMuseum to ask him about his own background, about the importance of history, about his role at the museum, and about what it's like to lead a team that is faced with tackling such a difficult and monumental task. Bart Ouvry, thank you very much for joining us here on the Low Countries podcast. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
My name is Bart Ouvry, and I've been director of this museum for about almost 2 years. I studied history and communication sciences, and the whole of my career was as a diplomat, Belgian diplomat first, then a European diplomat. And as both a Belgian and a European diplomat all over, I spent about 10 years in Africa. And I think that's my having been formed as a historian and having spent 10 years in Africa are the two elements which give me some legitimacy to take up this job.
We would love to go into your time in Africa. What are the main things that you take away from your 10 years experience there with relation to Belgian history?
Main thing which I take away from 10 years in Africa is that the world has changed. Not just our view on Africa, but the way Africans look at the world has changed. And I believe as Europeans, one of the messages which certainly in the last years when I was in the Sahel in Mali, which I gave to some of my interlocutors in the capital, in Brussels, is humility. We need to listen more. Many among us tend to still consider Europe as being the dominant power. And that's not just those who are in power. It's also, for example, NGOs. They believe that the Western world calls the shots worldwide. That's no longer the case. So the worldview of both Europeans and Africans has evolved and must evolve even more. This is a different world than we used to have in the 20th century.
When we're talking about identities, so you mentioned European identity, African, and we know that they are very big, diverse places. Would you say that there is an emerging modern African identity that covers the continent, the way that we can say perhaps for Europeans, like we are European? Is that something that you experienced?
I would disagree with your question. I would rather speak about identities. Africa is a huge continent, and so between south and north, between east, even we call ourselves AfricaMuseum, but we have to be honest. We cover more or less. We try to cover the whole of Africa, south of the Sahara, not the Maghreb. And even in Europe, identities. There are many identities. We have a number of things in common. But for example, one of the things which I refuse to talk about is European values. It sounds too much like, these are our values. I think what many consider as European values are universal or should be universal values and are widely shared worldwide and certainly with Africa. As a diplomat, I've been working in the Human Rights Council and I've found that very often, if you negotiate well, you talk well to your colleagues, that you find common ground with many. And certainly between Europe and Africa, on a number of questions, we could really find common ground.
We're here today at the AfricaMuseum, which has recently undergone a big renovation. Before it was known as the AfricaMuseum, or maybe it still is officially called the Royal Museum for Central Africa. And this institution has existed for over 120 years, I believe?
126 years.
Okay. And you grew up in Belgium, in Ghent. Did you ever visit this museum when you were young? And do you have any personal memories of visiting this museum before you had any professional interest in it?
Frankly, I once visited and I thought it was a dusty place. And so there was some fascination, of course, but it was a place which didn't tell me much about Africa the way I knew it from other sources. So it really didn't do the job. We have to admit that this was a scientific institution, and since 1960, independence of most African states up to, I would say, the beginning of the 21st century, not much was done about the museum. And we saw ourselves as a scientific institution, and we forgot a bit about the museum. We didn't know very well how to handle that.
Great. We'll certainly get more to talking about the museum in a little bit. But in your career as a diplomat, you said you also had a background in history and the study of history. What first sparked your interest in studying history?
Wow, that's I must say, as a very young kid, I read a lot, and I must admit that knowing about the past was for me something essential. And if I decided in the end to study history, it's because I thought it's one of the main ways to really understand what is happening around you. I've always been fascinated by, I read the papers when I was very young. I looked at television. There was no computers around at that time. I was fascinated, but you can't understand what's happening today. If you want to understand Syria, you have to know a bit about the history of the Middle East. And so that was my main motivation for studying history. It's about understanding what is happening, because we're all part of history. To a certain degree, we're actors. And I believe studying history is a way to know where you stand, where you come from, and where you go.
So in May 2023, you took up the position as director here. How different was this from your role as a diplomat? What did you learn as a diplomat that has helped you in this role? And what are some of the biggest challenges that you've faced since taking on this very big role in the newly branded AfricaMuseum?
There's many differences, but one of the main differences is that museums tend to take time. Before decisions are taken here, there's much scrutiny, there's discussion. And I must admit, coming from a world where sometimes in diplomacy you need to take a position in hours, if not minutes, I thought this was difficult. And I still believe that museums, if we want to respond to what people want today, we need to be more in real time. We can't always wait for history to take its course and then reflect it in your museum. I think as a museum you should very much be not in line. We can sometimes be in advance, a little bit in advance, or maybe follow certain events, but we can't wait for history to take its course. And for that, I think we need to be quicker. We can't always wait till our internal discussions have come to a conclusion and wait for total consensus. So I sometimes try to move a bit more quickly, which I must admit still means sometimes waiting for years for an exhibition or a project to come to fruition.
So you're saying that just as people are players in history, so too are museums at the time, and that you need to sort of be on the edge with it a little bit. What's happening in the narrative of the world, the museum should be keeping up to date with that.
Yeah. We have a new way of looking at museums, and I think that goes for most of us. If you look at the definition, the international definition of ICOM, the Federation of Museums, we want to be committed to society and to have a role in society. The first space which you see in a museum is a space about racism, and it's about racism today, which is present in our society in Belgium and Europe. And I think we need to play a role there. So we can't just commit ourselves to history and then forget about what happens in the streets of Brussels. So we need to be committed to taking a role in society. It means also we have 4 workshops in the museum for young kids, schools which come here. I think that's very important. Kids up till 18 years old come in for free. I think that's important to play a role for youth. So we really see ourselves as being committed to societal change. We're not necessarily those leading it, but we're a forum. We bring in people with very different points of view, and we want them to meet each other, to discuss, and that's the way to play a role. We don't necessarily we're not prescriptive. We're not the ones who produce opinions, but we are facilitators. And we're not neutral. We have a number of values.
Okay, so the museum sees itself as a forum, but the roots of the museum are something very different. Could you tell us a little bit about how the museum began and what this grand building which we see here was originally built for?
It all started, I would say, in 1830. In 1830, Belgium was created as a buffer state. The Treaty of London said Belgium is a buffer state between France and Germany, between the Netherlands and Great Britain. which is not an enviable position. So very early on, certainly the royalty, the King Leopold I and then King Leopold II, for this country, for geopolitical reasons, should have a colony, to be on par, to be on the same level as neighboring countries. And so Leopold II had an obsession with colonies. He developed something like 40 or 50 different projects, and Congo was actually project number 50. But it was not supported by the population. It was not supported by the government. And so when in 1897 there was a world exhibition here in Brussels, he decided to have a chapter about his colony, because the colonial project was not a project of the Belgian state. It was very much his own personal undertaking. And so he organized a exhibition here in the park, which were before were the hunting grounds of the Duke of Brabant, which as a successor to the throne he had been. And he created in the Africa Palace, which is still part of our offices, he created an exhibition. And near the water which you see over there, there were several Congolese villages, what we today consider as human zoos. People were exhibited there. And it was a major popular success. And that's when he understood that creating a museum was a way of organizing propaganda for his colonial undertaking, which initially with both the government and the population was very unpopular. People didn't like it. They said it's going to cost us a lot. It was not appreciated. And that was one of the reasons why he created the museum.
And could you summarize what narrative he was trying to push into the Belgian society to make them see that this was a positive thing?
I think the narrative of Leopold II was the narrative of many colonial museums and undertakings. If you look at history, you will see that 16th, 17th, 18th century literature, those who traveled on the coast of Africa, they usually had a relatively neutral or even positive view on Africa. This changed with colonization. The way of looking at Africa became much more stereotyped. And we said they are primitive, and we even said they are violent. And in the museum, as it was in the beginning, there was an emphasis in this kind of violence. One of the most well-known objects is a statue of Leopard Man. Yes, there was a fraternity of Leopard Man in Africa, in Congo, but also in other countries, in Kenya, for example. These fraternities have sometimes been accused of violence, but the kind of violence which is shown in the statue of Leopard Man, a man with a hood about to kill someone sleeping, is something which has never been demonstrated. We have some of those masks in our collection. Never have we found a trace of blood. So this was not historic. It was not very precise as a historic image. And it was also a very violent way of showing Africans. So we tended to emphasize how primitive Africans were, how violent they were. And it was, you can still find the words somewhere in the building. It says, Belgium brings civilization to Congo. And this is a thinking which, frankly, was still very much present in our way of looking at Africa up till the 20th century. And I believe today it is still, to a certain degree, present in our thinking. We have not completely decolonized. That's something which takes a certain while before we really come to a view of what we call today a partnership. When we work with Africa, we look for partnerships. Are those always equal partnerships? I don't think so, not yet. Though the world is changing geopolitically, now the South is emerging, and we should, that's why I told you earlier on about our worldview, which we should adapt.
So it seems that by the 21st century, the RMCA it needed updating. It wasn't matching the kind of wider historical perspective. Is that a fair statement?
I believe when my predecessor came 20 years ago, he found a museum which was really, it was about to become a museum of a museum, showing how a colonial museum looked like. There had been no investment and no fundamental change. So we didn't just need to redo the buildings, we needed completely to rethink the permanent exhibition and our way of functioning. This started slowly, and I don't claim that we have reached the status where you could say we are a decolonial museum. This is something which you realize gradually, and which is a change of mind as much as a change in the way our infrastructure is and our exhibition is being organized.
Very often in the literature around the museum, this is spoken about as a decolonisation of the museum. Could you talk about that word for a little bit? What does it mean? Is it a process that can be completed, or is it something that is ongoing continually?
I see it as a process, and I believe that I always say your decolonization is not my decolonization. There's always a different perspective. There's a different perspective for me being a white man. My family has been in this country for several generations. For someone from the diaspora who defines him or herself as being diaspora or Afro-descendant, it's very different, because these people still feel the effect of racism today. And they, for example, certainly the activists, they sometimes tell us, we don't ask you to heal those wounds. This wound will remain open for quite some time. And I can understand that perspective. There's a different perspective, again, decolonization for Africans. Certainly in a country like Kenya, which is, lower but middle income country, for them, the colonization is the past, and they move forward. And not just Kenyans, but also Congolese, they come here and they say, it's good you talk about the past, it's good you talk to colonization, but do not reduce Africa to its colonial past. There was an earlier past, and you will find a room about long-term history, archaeology, and the whole history before the colonization really started. And what we need to do, and that's one of my objectives for this museum, it's to talk more and it's to show more about Africa today. The art scene, architecture, biodiversity. Africa today has a lot to offer and is really evolving rapidly. So we shouldn't just linger on the past. Of course, our basic aim is to recognize the past, to recognize the mistakes which were done by the past. But we should not just limit ourselves to the past. So those are three groups who look differently at colonization. And then, of course, you have the whole political scene, and they look at decolonization in a different way. Then you have restitution. So there are many. That's why in any exhibition here, we always try to have a multiplicity of views. And I would say it's never enough, because there are so different perspectives on history and about relations between Belgium and Congo, relations between Africa and Europe. It's not an easy job.
It sounds very complex, and it seems like as you were saying, your experience in the diplomatic corps has really brought that to work with many different groups and to try to drive things through. Did you face some people who worked here already? Was there a little bit of pushback to your approach in that regard when you came in from maybe staff who have been here for a while? Or
no, don't underestimate how difficult it is for staff in such a museum. During my first weeks, I heard a few colleagues say, "Oh, we are a controversial museum." I said, "Stop saying that. It may be for some, but we as museum staff, we should be very proud about a museum which is trying to do a good job about very controversial issues." And I find that I'm actually, since I've arrived here, I've been working to improve our own way of functioning, which is still very much of a challenge. Because if you try to be open and to be working with many outside stakeholders, internally you need to be well organized as well. And I must admit, it's still a challenge, and we're not there. And only a few days we discussed it, and And actually all those in our board of directors sitting around the table said, this is an issue for us. I feel the criticism gets at me personally. So not an easy job. If you're looking for an easy job, you should go and work maybe in the post office or something like that. Well, I don't claim that postman is an easy job, but this is really a challenging job for everyone.
Our interview with Bart Ouvry will continue after this short break.
I think when people think about the controversy of a museum like this, they often imagine, and maybe they say this correctly, that a lot of the objects which are displayed in the museum are stolen or inappropriately obtained by the museum. And you mentioned before about the restitution of artifacts. And from what I've read is that in July 2022, the Federal Parliament of Belgium passed a law which was creating a framework about returning goods which have been taken from the colonial past back to their point of origin. Can you tell us a little bit about the complications of that policy and how it impacts the museum?
Well, we have a law, but that doesn't mean that we have a policy in place. What we need, and of course the 2/3 of our collections come from Congo, and of those 2/3, 2/3 again, have been obtained before the First World War. So largely during the period of the Free State of Congo. So we know that there are quite some of them have a controversial way of having been obtained. In the permanent exhibition, we show this. We have a circuit where we put, a specific sticker where you can see, well, this may have, and there are some comments which you can obtain through a QR code, which talk about the way it was obtained. Sometimes by theft, sometimes by violence, sometimes people were killed. And we try to tell this story. We actually now, Belgium is waiting for a reaction on the Belgian proposal to have a treaty which will create a framework. Because one thing which I know, in 2022, for example, during a state visit, there was one object which was handed over by King Philip as a symbolic preempting, in a way, the restitution. The choice of that object was done in a few weeks in a rather haphazard manner.
Could you tell us about the object quickly? What was the object?
It's a Kakungu mask. It's something which is very impressive. It's a big mask, the kind of masks which were used during initiation ceremonies. It's from the Kwilu, from a particular area in Congo. So there was no full discussion in that choice. So there was no consensual decision to take it because there were only a few weeks. The time was not there. As a symbolic gesture, I can understand why it was done. But in the end, we have gotten quite some criticism on that choice. And of course, you can wonder why that object? Why from that area and why not from other areas in Congo? So I believe if we do restitution, it must be done based on a broad discussion, not just between states. Our law says the decision in the end will be taken by the states, but we should also consult with with communities of origin. They might not have the last decisive say in it, but it must be there must at least be good information, and probably, at least that's my personal view, you will need consultation in order to do a good job. Because it's not just about, we as Europeans typically, we tend to look at the objects. The Africans tell us, well, it's not just about the objects, it's about their meaning. Those objects have a cultural, spiritual, political meaning. And so if you just hand it back without looking into what is their meaning, you will not do a good job. So it's really not easy. I know that don't misunderstand me, I don't say that we need to take eternity. And we can certainly start on a number of objects to go forward. But I believe that we need to do it in the right way, with a real discussion involving source communities.
And that's people in Belgium, people in Congo, and not just states and governments, but museums, for instance, or research groups. Yeah. Great. And I imagine with 40,000 plus objects, it's a A monumental task.
Our whole collection is 130,000 cultural objects, but the emphasis will probably be, and what we see, for example, in neighboring countries, there are a number of objects which have a very symbolic meaning, which are very dear to the heart of people, and so much of the discussion may go there. But actually, it's very much uncharted territory. We don't know how to do this necessarily. In a number of procedures, we may know how to do it. This is largely a new subject, and I'm looking for good practices.
And have you taken concrete steps in the 18 months that you've been the director to do that already?
What we had started after the law was voted was to put more resources into provenance research. And when I arrived, we also had a publication about that, about provenance research. And then it was one of my first decisions. We decided to do an exhibition on that. And this exhibition, I believe, has been very good in showing the reality of the subject, showing how some objects in our collection are controversial, and showing at the same time that we are willing to communicate about that and to work on it. And I think it was maybe not a major popular success, but it was a good exhibition. We had very good press also internationally, and many people coming from Congo or from Africa appreciated the exhibition very much. So that was our way of showing, as an institution, we want to go forward. Because those who believe that this would be a bad thing for the museum, we will lose object. We have a huge collection. We can only exhibit a few percentage points of the whole collection. Today we are sharing with other museums in Europe, in the United States. Why not share with Africa as well? So this process, in the end, will increase our legitimacy as an Africa museum in Europe.
So I understand that because, of course, the museum underwent 5 years of renovation between 2013 and 2018, and it was met with some resistance upon opening and activism as well, people protesting out the front. With this approach and these steps, are you finding that you are making ground in consulting with, say, the African diaspora that's here, the Afro-descendant population, the people in Africa themselves and people in Belgium? Are you getting any feedback in your time since taking over that those reasons for protest are being met?
Let me come back on that situation. We completely renovated and built. We doubled the number of square meters available for exhibitions. Technically, this was quite a challenge. At the same time, we had a complete rethinking of the permanent exhibition. Actually, I would claim that 5 years was too short. And so during the last year, there was an enormous pressure on moving forward. And if you want to include source communities, if you want to include diaspora representatives, this doesn't go together very easily, because discussion takes time, consultation takes time. And so I believe that during the last months, probably we were not in a position to take sufficient time. And so it became a bit chaotic. It became, decisions were taken quickly because there was time pressure. And that's one of the reasons why this whole structure, because there was a consultation structure, maybe not with source communities, but mainly with people from the diasporas here in Belgium. If it went sour, it was because there was too much pressure. So I would plead, I wouldn't necessarily blame anyone. We were just under pressure to reopen, and it may have been too much pressure. And there were a number of elements in that exhibition. If you look at in the big rotunda, for example, we showed some stereotyped, even outright racist statues, and we hadn't contextualized them sufficiently. We thought we had done a little, but actually we hadn't. It was insufficient. Even what is there today is not always well understood, because meanwhile we had the visit, for example, of a UN group on people of African descent, and they said, this big rotunda with those racist statues, it doesn't work. We knew about that, but we were obliged because it's protected by heritage services, we couldn't move them. And then we asked, after the reopening, we asked an artist, do something about that. And he brought a number of curtains, they're transparent, but on those curtains he printed counter images. And so the contextualization which we are doing there improves things. So what we have done, yes, we made mistakes, but we listened to our stakeholders and then we took action to improve things. Maybe that in 5 years we will again look at the rotunda and take other measures. Or for example, what I would ideally do, if I had more resources, I would put standing guides there, mediators, people who explain. Because this kind of stereotyping is a subtle process. It's not always well understood by the white man, which I am. It may be very well understood immediately by someone who is Afro-descendant, but not by me. So I believe that you need mediators for that. So I'm thinking about that. It's all a matter of resources taking action. And I believe it's not easily said in a museum, but even in a museum, sometimes you cannot avoid mistakes. Or what may not have been a mistake 5 years ago may today, in the present context, be a mistake. So we're struggling. I admit we don't have an answer to all questions, and I hope we are moving forward. But sometimes we move forward after having made a mistake.
Would it not be easier just to make a new building in a new location which doesn't have any of the racist imagery built into it?
It would maybe be easier, but it would not necessarily be better. Because what we can do here, we can show what we did in our colonial past, what we did in terms of stereotyping. So showing some of those images of those statues. For example, we have an enormous collection of colonial photography. Putting that in the context and allowing people to uncover how they were influenced in the past, I believe that's a good thing. It's not easy. I was guiding a group of diplomats, actually, last Saturday, and the Africans there told me that it was sometimes very emotional for them. And we have to take that into account. So it means it's not easy. And I know there's still a number of people of African descent who tell me, I don't dare to go into that museum. But many do. And I believe if it allows us to come together, in the end, I believe that's our role as a museum in society. It's to bring people together. And it's to, allow them to understand what went wrong in the past. And so moving to a new building might not have allowed us to do that, but it was not the easiest choice.
Sure. I really commend it. It brings to mind for me, following the Holocaust and World War II, Germany had to implement a policy, what they call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, like coming to terms with the past. And it's not hiding it away, it's pushing it up. And it's often struck me that many colonial nations have never been forced to do this or never had to do it. But now around the world, we are seeing history becoming a bit of a battleground. So in the States, for instance, in Australia, all over Europe. So during this process of decolonising this museum, have you encountered Belgians who are taking the position that you're attacking their history? What would you say to people who feel that their history has come under attack as more open narratives have come into the fray?
Absolutely. We have an association which historically was founded by former colonial civil servants. They're called Mémoire du Congo. They still meet in the museum, which is sometimes controversial. Sometimes people tell me you shouldn't allow them to have meetings in the museum. Well, I prefer them to come to the museum, and I'm not in agreement with a number of their positions. But they are evolving. And I think the fact that we received in the museum is a way of not necessarily confronting, but allowing them to, see our common past together with others and trying to come to terms. This is a process. If today they don't see things maybe the way that, most of us see it, you must know that 20 years ago, there was an interrogation organized by a university asking people, what do you think about the colonial past? A majority of them answered, well, the colonies, in the end, it was a good thing. Development, roads, etc. We created schools. Recently, there was likewise an interrogation, and today it's a majority of Belgians who believe that, well, colonization was not a good thing. We must admit that it was very unequal, sometimes violent. So the minds are evolving. This is a gradual process. It doesn't happen in one go. We as a museum should contribute to that. And those people who have a different opinion, I want them to come to the museum. And I want us to have a discussion. Does it work well? Not always. Sometimes we have, for example, people who say that they had a guide who was too committed. Link it a bit to the debate which came to us from America, woke, anti-woke. We as a museum, we should try to have both groups coming to our museums and to come to terms with the past in a way. Not easy, but we're trying to welcome different groups, not just to limit ourselves to one group.
We understand the stated mission of AfricaMuseum now is to become a centre for knowledge and resources on Africa, in particular Central Africa, in a historical, contemporary and global context. What are some of the ways that excite you the most about how the museum's striving to achieve this into the future?
I have to disappoint you because in a few days we're going to publish our new mission.
Oh no! Scoop.
We're going to publish our new mission and vision.
You heard it here first, folks.
And what I told you a few seconds before about being a forum, for example, is a bit different, because before we saw ourselves as a center of knowledge. We toned that down a little because we believe that. The knowledge is not necessarily, and is certainly not just within the walls of this museum. So much of the knowledge is in Africa. That's why I'm so glad that we're not just a museum, we're also a scientific institution. We have partnerships with scientific institutions in about 20 African countries. So this is very important for us, not to be the knowledge center. Let's say much knowledge is in Africa. Of course, through our collections, through our research, there's also knowledge here. But you do not build a history, or you do not write history just based on knowledge. You need people bringing their perspective. And so these different perspectives, we want to bring them in our museum, in our scientific work. So that's a bit of a nuance on it's an evolution. It's not a breaking point. It's an evolution in our mission.
That was really beautifully put, and it's such a new way of looking at things that, one institution can't just be the arbiter of knowledge. So,
and the previous one sounded a bit like that.
Yeah. And finally, going through this process, your team, you, everyone who's contributed, there are other societies and museums around the world, institutions that are seeking to do something similar, to decolonize, so to speak. What are some of the major pieces of advice that you can give them in trying to achieve that you've learned through this process?
It's decolonization, I believe, it's about building gradually relations of trust with stakeholders. And do not limit yourselves to stakeholders in your own country. The new title, which I like most for our kinds of museums, which were before called ethnographic museum or anthropological museums, is world museums. We try to be museums about world culture. It means that you need a very large network of contacts in order to do your job well. Source communities, but also scientific communities worldwide. You should build those relations. And that's really a long-term undertaking. When I arrived here, I thought, well, in a year and a half, I'll be able to build all those relations. Wow, it's going to take me way longer. And I'll be happy if I can build relations with the team and myself with maybe a fraction of those who I would need. You can't talk to everyone who you would need to talk to. It's a huge undertaking. But take a large approach and don't come to conclusions too quickly, which I must admit, my personality, I want to go forward. I want results. There's always this balance between having results. And of course, you need to build exhibitions, you need to go forward. But at the same time, you need to be in a listening mood before being in an action mood.
Bart Ouvry, thank you very much for taking some time to join us today. And I wish you all the best with your future endeavors here at AfricaMuseum.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to know more about Flemish and Dutch history and culture? Visit www.the-low-countries.com. This podcast is made by Republic of Amsterdam Radio.